Bonjour à tous et bienvenue si vous nous rejoignez pour cet entretien exceptionnel avec Elise Ann Allen. Elise Ann Allen, vous êtes américaine, diplômée en philosophie et en communication. Vous vivez à Rome, vous êtes ce que l'on appelle vaticaniste, correspondante pour le média Crux. Je signale au passage que votre mari, John Allen, a aussi été un éminent vaticaniste avec qui nous avons partagé beaucoup de voyages du pape. Vous avez été la première vaticaniste à décrocher une grande interview avec le pape Léon XIV et vous publiez une biographie avec le contenu de cette interview qui paraît ce 19 novembre aux éditions Artege et aux éditions du Rocher sous le titre « Léon XIV, pape missionnaire d'une Église mondialisée ». Voilà que je fais tomber le livre. C'est intéressant. Merci Elise Ann d'être avec nous. Bonjour.
Good afternoon, Philippe. It's wonderful to be with you. I normally see you in Rome or on the papal plane, but now it's wonderful to be with you in France today.
Merci d'être passé par KTO. Votre livre, votre ouvrage est très très intéressant parce qu'il entremêle en fait plusieurs choses. Il y a le récit biographique du pape, de chacune des grandes étapes de sa vie. Il y a les témoignages et les anecdotes de nombreuses personnes qui l'ont côtoyé à ces différentes étapes. Et puis ces deux entretiens que vous avez réalisés, l'un dans lequel le pape commente lui-même son parcours et on a donc aussi son propre écho sur ces différentes étapes et ce que disent de lui les uns et les autres. Et puis un autre entretien qui se trouve à la fin du livre, plus prospectif sur sa vision de différents sujets d'actualité aujourd'hui dans le monde et dans l'Église. On a beaucoup écrit depuis le 8 mai dernier sur Léon XIV, mais c'est vrai que dans votre livre, on apprend un certain nombre de choses, des grandes et des toutes petites. Je voudrais commencer par une toute petite, c'est quand même invraisemblable. On apprend qu'une de ses voisines, une maman de l'école, quand il était petit, disait de lui qu'il serait le premier pape américain.
Yeah, and he confirmed that was the truth. His brothers said it, and then he confirmed it himself, which, you know, as one of the brothers said, who would inspire somebody to say that? What did they, think? But there's clearly something prophetic there.
On apprend, en tout cas, on découvre que c'était un bon élève, un garçon studieux, appliqué. Il était aussi engagé dans l'équipe de bowling, dans celle de l'art oratoire et du débat, mais surtout, c'était un garçon gentil, attentionné envers les autres, avec un vrai esprit d'équipe, au fond, déjà enfant, et que cette vocation à la prêtrise, elle était évidente dès le plus jeune âge. Tout le monde le dit.
No, I think, and people still say that now. If you read, through the testimonies, of people who knew him, as a child, they said that, but then also people who worked alongside of him in Peru, that he's incredibly smart, attentive to details, very humble. People from his childhood said he just stood out, that he was a very special person from a young age, and you could tell that from the time he was playing mass with his mother's ironing board, in their house, and knew all the parts in Latin, but that spirit about him carried through, and you could see that, in the testimonies and the people who knew him throughout his missionary years, but also his years as superior of his order. Those qualities continued to accompany him, and I think they've accompanied him right up to the papacy.
On reviendra sur ces grands traits de sa personnalité, mais d'abord un mot de sa famille, de ses racines familiales, qui sont en réalité multiples au point que votre titre, un pape missionnaire d'une Église mondialisée, c'est déjà presque dans ses gènes par la multiplicité des origines familiales.
That's exactly why I wanted to title the book like I did, because he is so diverse, and he really is a pope for the world because of his own blood in his own house. He has so many different cultural and ethnic elements to who he is. There is some French in there also, Spanish. His mother has Haitian roots, this Creole side of the family, so he has a darker complexion, and he talks about people when he was young, commenting on his mother's dark complexion, almost in a racist way at times, which I found interesting. So he had to deal with some of that. But also, as we'll talk later, I'm sure, through his global experience and his vast experience traveling the world. He's somebody that really does know the world and in his own blood, but also through his experience in service over the years. So he really is a pope for the world.
pourquoi est-ce qu'il choisit, on a cette vocation à la prêtrise dès l'enfance, mais pourquoi est-ce qu'il choisit l'ordre de Saint-Augustin?
You know, I think it was because, and you know, I asked him that, you know, in our conversation, and I think it's because his family had direct experience with the Augustinians. His brothers attended an Augustinian school. His mother, you know, was the librarian there, so they were very involved in the Augustinians, with the Augustinian, at least at the educational level. So they did his education and the family's education, but he also really liked two aspects, I think, of the Augustinian community. Versus doing a diocesan priesthood or entering a different order. And that was the communitarian aspect. He liked the emphasis that the Augustinians placed on community. You know, he had what he described as a very healthy and happy childhood, a very, very happy family dynamic growing up. So I think the communitarian aspect of the Augustinians really reflected what his experience was as a child. And I think he wanted something that you know, allowed him to live that in his vocation and in his life of service. But it was also precisely the service aspect, not just of the priesthood, but of the Augustinians as missionaries. He talked about feeling this call since he was quite young of wanting to go out and be a missionary, you know, not wanting to just stay at home and do whatever you do, you know, but he really felt this call to go out. So to be a missionary, that the communitarian aspect, but also the missionary aspect were very appealing to him very early on. So I think that's what set the Augustinians aside versus any other order he could have joined.
Ses attentes ont été comblées puisque les Augustins vont l'envoyer au Pérou une première fois en 1985 pour 1 an, puis à nouveau en 88 pour 10 ans cette fois, et puis il va retourner après 2013 quand il est nommé administrateur apostolique puis évêque du diocèse de Chiclayo. On sait à quel point le Pérou l'a marqué puisqu'il en parle lui-même très, très largement, mais c'est aussi la rencontre avec une église latino-américaine qui est particulière. Si on parle de synodalité, si on parle de manière de vivre dans les communautés paroissiales, il va faire là l'expérience d'une église spécifique.
It was a very special church. It was a very special context when he arrived, because when he arrived in Peru in 1985, as you mentioned, for the first time, you know, it was very interesting because Peru, at the cultural level, you know, and sort of societal level, was in a big social crisis. There was a political crisis at the time. There was an economic crisis. There was rampant poverty. There was terrorism. You know, you had the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, and another terrorist group. So it was a very complicated time socially and politically. But also at the ecclesia level, it was also very interesting because you were in the years almost, you know, it was just 20 years after the Second Vatican Council. And South America, Latin America really had a very unique implementation of the council. And so he came in the years when that was really starting to develop. And there were a lot of interesting theological discussions happening at the time, including liberation theology and sort of the life that took on, not only in Peru, was born in Peru, but it took on its own life throughout Latin America and eventually the Universal Church. So it's something, he arrived in some very special years with some very special contexts. And I think that really shaped the type of pastor that he went on to become. I mean, how could it not, right?
Et de fait, c'est un pasteur qui va donner beaucoup de responsabilités aux laïcs, notamment aux femmes, et faire vivre sa communauté paroissiale ou sa communauté pastorale d'une façon où chacun se sente accueilli.
I think that's exactly right, and it's what you were touching on synodality before. This sort of synodal church, if you ask many of the people that I interviewed, they said, you know, when Pope Francis started talking about synodality, this sort of collaborative style of being church, you know, a way of interacting, you know, yeah, very collaboratively between pastor and faithful. They said, we've been doing that for decades. We've been practicing that, you know, specifically with the Augustinians and the specific parish model they had. They called, you know, a new image of the parish, you know, where the parish was divided into different zones, and each zone was managed by a lay team that would go out and do catechesis, because of course the territories are so big. The priors, you know, the Augustinians couldn't get out to all these areas as often as the people needed. So they depended a lot on the lay people and worked with them to reach the people and to get and to meet their needs in the very rural areas, the very far away areas. So it really was this beautiful collaboration between the community, the priests and the Augustinian brothers who ran these parishes and the people themselves. It was a collaboration from the beginning. And of course, many of these lay teams that led, that were in charge of each parish zone were led by women. And women had a very, very clear protagonistic role in the parishes from the beginning. So this is something this is a dynamic that Robert Prevost and now Pope Leo is very familiar with.
Ça, c'est à l'intérieur de la vie de l'Église, dans son organisation. Vous rappeliez la situation très particulière du Pérou dans ces années-là, avec des crises multiples. Est-ce que c'est un prêtre engagé, comme on dirait? Est-ce qu'il porte aussi une parole dans la société?
He does. He's very active. He's very engaged, but in a silent way. And you see what he did in Peru. He was, in the first few years, that he was there. So the first year in 1985. He was just a new priest, it was his first pastoral assignment. And he was following, the example of what the community did. His bishop at the time, John McNabb, the other brothers who were there, he was doing apostolate, he was doing pastoral activity the way they did. And when he went to Trujillo, he replicated that. And he was very involved. And as Bishop of Chiclayo, he had crises from almost the moment he arrived. In 2017, there was the Niño Costero phenomenon, which was this big coastal phenomenon with a lot of flooding. It destroyed many houses and territories. And then you had the COVID-19 pandemic. And then you had this typhoon that wiped out a lot of territory and a lot of housing. And then you had political crises. And at every single point along the way, and of course the political crises of the 1990s, he was always there beside the people, advocating for justice, advocating for their rights and for their dignity, not in a political way. He would say, our job is to be pastors accompanying the people, not to get involved in partisan politics. So he was somebody that did not need to speak out a lot. He gave very few interviews and made very few public statements, but he was always present, and I think that's the type of pastor he is. And that's maybe a challenge for some people now, seeing him as Pope. They want him to use his voice more. That's a comment I've heard. We wish we'd see him speaking out more, but that's he communicates much more through presence and through his actions. He was always present, but without calling attention to himself. And I think that's very much his pastoral instinct. That's the kind of pastor that he very much is at heart, active and involved.
Il y aurait plein de choses à dire sur son activité au Pérou, mais si on veut connaître les détails, il faut lire votre livre. Je saute donc une étape. Il va être pendant 2 mandats, de 2001 à 2013, le supérieur général de son ordre. Comment est-ce qu'il va exercer cette fonction et en quoi est-ce que ça l'aide peut-être aujourd'hui, ou en tout cas ça l'a préparé à ce qui est aujourd'hui son ministère de successeur de Pierre?
I'm really glad you asked this question, because most people want to focus only on Peru, or his time in the Roman Curia, his last 2 years. But this is a very important part of his vocational journey, but also his career, if you want to say, because he's been in leadership from almost the beginning of his vocation. After that first year in Peru, he was then sent and he was put in charge of the formation house in Trujillo and put in charge of parishes. And then he was named prior provincial, so the superior of his province in Chicago, but for a very short time, and immediately was named, prior general of the Augustinian order. So this is a role that he took on and embraced very strongly. He was somebody who was, again, very active with sort of the formal things that he had to do, traveling all over. He visited every community house that the Augustinians had throughout the world. He said he visited over 4 countries, and many of them he visited multiple times for official ceremonies, for anniversaries, but also to see in some provinces why the order was growing so fast. For example, Nigeria and Cebu in the Philippines are the 2 fastest growing provinces for the Augustinians outside of Spain, which is their biggest province. So some of the trips were just to see what's going right. So he was somebody who was very well-traveled, very interested. He didn't want to delegate some of these trips to other lower-level officials. He wanted to do them himself because he wanted to understand what's going on. So that shows you also how involved he is, but how intellectual he is and how curious he is. But then also he was doing translations of, like, they have specific Augustinian prayers that are, specific to the Augustinian order. And he would translate those into English himself, and oversee behind the scenes things. And also I know they were building new properties for the Augustinian Curia. They redid some buildings then. So he was also managing all of the construction and the design of that. And if you read the book, you'll see he's always been involved in construction projects as well and building things, throughout his ecclesial career as well. So I think that experience, I don't know how many other cardinals had that experience going into the conclave of having managed and overseen a global order already before their election as Pope. I don't know that many can say that. So I think that time for him was very important for what he's going to do now, because he got a sense really for the church all over the world and its needs all over the world, but also the different cultures and how that the faith is expressed in different cultures. And that was a big topic for Francis as well, sort of the enculturation. And Robert Prévost, now Léon XIV, is somebody who understands that instinctively.
De fait, c'est une personnalité très, très complète. Il était, les derniers jours avant le conclave, dans la liste de ceux dont l'élection était possible, mais il n'était pas archi-favori. Et a posteriori, pourtant, tous les cardinaux ont dit « c'est apparu comme une évidence ». Tant cet homme est un homme qui synthétise énormément de sujets. Je reviens sur sa personnalité. Vous soulignez et vous montrez comment, on le dit timide, mais en même temps, c'est quelqu'un qui aime profondément les gens et qui aime être entouré, qui aime être avec les gens. C'est un homme de dialogue, qui aime rassembler, embarquer les gens avec lui, mais c'est aussi un homme qui sait prendre des décisions et qui n'a pas peur de l'adversité quand il faut trancher un sujet, quand il faut prendre une décision. C'est un administrateur, vous l'avez dit, qui aime organiser les projets, qui n'a pas peur des questions financières, qui n'a pas peur des questions d'organisation, mais c'est aussi un pasteur qui veut d'abord voir comment chacun peut vivre sa vie de chrétien. C'est presque une synthèse parfaite. Cet homme, vous, c'est quoi le trait de sa personnalité qui vous marque le plus?
That's a tough question to answer, because he has so many traits that I think are very important for what and like you mentioned, he has the perfect profile. He's done absolutely everything in terms of administration and pastoral experience, being a missionary. I think his biggest quality, I would say, is his heart of service, because for him, it's always his vocation and everything that he's done, even his time as administrators, in any administrative role he's had, it's always been at the service of the people. He's very person-oriented. He always looks to the person in front of him. What do they need? And how can I meet that need? And whether that's a poor family in northern Peru, who lost their home or who doesn't have food on the table, or whether that is his Augustinian order. What does the order need, or what does it need in this place? He's somebody that is so fundamentally focused on other people. And that was my experience also in the brief conversations I've had with him. He's almost more attentive to me than I have, than I was to him. And that's, as an interviewer, but also as somebody who knew him previously in different contexts. You always try to be attentive, to your guest or to your friend. But he's somebody that is so humble and so focused on other people. I think that is the most important quality that I've noticed in him.
Dites-moi, Elise Ann, chez Catéo, on n'a pas mauvais esprit, mais franchement, vous n'avez pas trouvé de détracteurs ou de critiques, parce qu'on n'en trouve pas dans le livre. On trouve des gens qui expliquent qu'à un moment, ils ont eu des désaccords avec lui, mais il n'y a pas de critique sur l'homme.
That was something that struck me while I was also doing the interviews. Nobody had anything really critical to say. And of course, when you're interviewing people about the new Pope, they're going to be very careful about what they're saying. Nobody's going to want to criticize him out loud. So it was difficult to find somebody that had critical voices, and I think when people talk about the disagreements they had with him, it was almost like the criticism was maybe he could be too quick to judge something, or to make a judgment about something, But then he was always willing to like adjust his thinking, you know, with time and experience. You know, if he could be proven wrong, he was always willing to even apologize and to say, maybe you were right, or let's do it this way. So, you know, the criticisms I've heard since, and it's not necessarily in the book, but now people want him to do or say more. They say he's being too quiet. He's not using his voice enough.
Et puis chacun voudrait le ramener à son propre camp. Ça, c'est le lot de tous les papes. Vous l'avez rencontré en 2018 et c'est ce qui explique aussi la genèse de ce livre parce que vous le connaissiez avant qu'il fût pape. Vous l'avez rencontré en 2018 pour une interview à propos de Sodalicio, qui est ce mouvement de vie apostolique né au Pérou dans les années 70, qui a été finalement dissous définitivement par le Vatican en 2025 à la suite de nombreux abus et dérives. Vous l'avez interrogé à ce sujet parce qu'il s'occupait aussi des questions d'abus. Sa position aujourd'hui sur cette crise qui traverse l'Église?
I think Robert Prevost is somebody that understands the abuse crisis very well. As somebody who's been in positions of leadership and authority within the church almost his entire ecclesial career, he's seen a lot of cases in a lot of different contexts, you know, and he's somebody that has worked a lot on this issue. He's somebody that's listened to a lot of victims. In the Sodalicio case in Peru, like you mentioned, like, you know, that was the first time that we had a conversation, was to speak about this case. And I was struck by how transparent he was and how honest he was with his answers. And this was just a background conversation. It was not on the record at the time, you know. So he was very free and he wanted to give me a lot of information about that. But he's somebody that even outside of Peru, of course, he was head of the National Safeguarding Commission there, and he got their guidelines in place. So he's somebody that knows the importance of guidelines and of protocols and of having systems in place. And that's what he did in Peru. But even as head of the Augustinians, I'm sure he encountered cases throughout the world, you know, whether that was in Africa or in Asia or even in the United States, there were cases I think he had to deal with. So he's familiar with the abuse crisis, but at a global level, because he's had to deal with this problem at a global level in the positions that he's had. So he's somebody that knows it very well. And as a canonist, I think he understands a lot of the canonical problems that make dealing with these cases very difficult at times and very frustrating for victims. You know, so as he says at some point in the book, you know, in our interview, he wants to address at least legal hang-ups in the process, why this takes so long, and how can we make this less painful for victims while still maintaining an authoritative judicial system.
Mm-hmm. Dans le grand entretien final, qui est plus prospectif, vous l'interrogez sur de nombreux sujets, notamment sur la question de la polarisation, à la fois dans le monde et dans l'Église. Qu'est-ce qu'il dit de cela, lui, que tout le monde présente comme un homme d'unité?
This, I think, is one of the biggest concerns that Pope Leo has. You know, when he came out on the balcony on May 8th, in his introductory remarks to the world, he mentioned peace, first of all, that he wants to be a Pope of peace, peace be with you. But he also talked about building bridges. And I think he meant that in many ways. You know, he's referring, I think, to the wars that are happening. You know, they're very big conflicts that are causing a lot of problems, you know, throughout the world. But also interecclesially, there are a lot of divisions that have made it very difficult for the church to be united and to be unified and to understand or even see people we disagree with as part of the church itself. Well, you're not Catholic enough, almost, or you're not really Catholic in this way of your thinking. You know, I think polarization is something that Leo is very concerned about. He mentioned it many times in our conversation, and I think it's something he wants to address. You know, in the pre-conclave meetings, those general congregation meetings, the cardinals talked about wanting to find somebody who could bring back a sense of unity and communion within the church. And they see him as somebody who can do that. And in many ways, that's what he's been trained in. That's what he's been formed in, given his Augustinian, you know, formation, but also his own personal style and way of doing things is very collaborative. And he likes to listen. He's a very good listener, and he listens and talks with people before he makes a decision. And I think that's going to be very important in terms of how he handles polarization as Pope.
Vous soulignez dans le livre combien pour tout pape, le choix de son nom et les premières paroles nous donnent déjà un très grand nombre de clés. Les premières paroles, vous venez d'en parler, la pace sia con tutti voi, la paix soit avec vous tous. Le choix de son nom, il s'en est expliqué notamment en référence à la révolution que nous sommes en train de vivre à travers l'intelligence artificielle. Et là-dessus, vous l'interrogez beaucoup aussi. On n'oublie pas que c'est un mathématicien et que le progrès technique l'intéresse énormément. Il n'est pas du tout hostile au progrès, mais il y a en même temps énormément de questions qui se posent pour la place de l'être humain.
I think he looks at it exactly that way because he is a mathematician, His mind sees all facets of a problem, and it wants to put it into formulas, So he sees the problem, and I think he's diagnosed this very accurately as the big question of the future and the big topic of the future. So he understands this is going to have a huge impact on humanity. And he sees the potential there, the creativity. As he mentioned also in the interview, there's vast amounts of potential for human creativity, but there's also a lot to be concerned about, in terms of the loss of what's human, our understanding of the truth, but also in terms of this growing disparity between rich and poor, the wage gaps, between CEOs with large pay packages. He specifically mentioned Elon Musk, and then workers themselves. And our workers going to lose their jobs to, this technological revolution. So he's somebody that very much wants to have this conversation. And because he is a mathematician, he's very precise and he's going to get down to the detail when you do it. So I think I'm personally very much looking forward to whatever he has to say already, but going forward on this issue.
Et vous attendez sans doute aussi, comme moi, comme nous tous, le prochain voyage qui va l'emmener en Turquie et au Liban et qui sera intégralement en direct sur KTO. Votre état d'esprit, d'un mot, à l'aube de ce voyage?
I'm very excited for this trip. It's not any first trip for a pope is very exciting. It's sort of their first moment really on the global stage outside of their election, but it's going to be his first real political message to the world and what he says to the authorities, the diplomatic corps in Turkey and in Lebanon, but also very diverse, church communities, their Christian communities, Catholic and non-Catholic. And, that's been such a strong theme in the church in the last few years. So whatever he's going to say is very important, especially in that region right now, given the conflict. So I am very excited to hear what he has to say.
On suivra ça avec beaucoup d'attention. Merci Elise Ann d'être venue sur le plateau de KTO. Léon XIV, pape missionnaire d'une église mondialisée. C'est dans toutes les bonnes librairies à partir de ce 19 novembre. Merci à vous d'être venue.
Thank you, Philippine, for having me. It's been a pleasure.